The sun dipped low over the cracked asphalt of Highway 93, painting the sky in streaks of molten gold and blood red. The air was thick with the heat of the dying day, a stillness broken only by the distant growl of engines tearing through the desert silence. Out here, miles from the nearest town, the world felt abandoned. Nothing but sand, scrub, and the endless ribbon of road stretching into nowhere. In the center of that nowhere, a circle of motorcycles gleamed under the fading light, their chrome catching the sun like shards of a broken mirror. The Steel Serpents, a biker gang with a reputation carved in violence and fear, had stopped their ride for something more than a break. Their bikes formed a rough ring, a cage of metal and menace, and in the middle stood Rex, a Rottweiler, massive and unyielding, his black and tan coat streaked with dirt and blood. His broad chest heaved, muscles trembling from exhaustion, but his dark eyes burned with a fire that refused to dim. Every breath was a fight, every twitch of his ears a defiance against the pain coursing through him. The bikers jeered, their voices a harsh chorus of mockery. "Look at this mutt, still thinks he's tough," one shouted, spitting into the dust. Another swung a heavy chain in lazy arcs, the clank of metal punctuating their laughter. Rex didn't flinch. His low growl rumbled like thunder, a warning from a storm they couldn't see coming. Blood matted the fur along his flank where a crowbar had struck, and one ear bore a fresh tear, but he held his ground. He wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier, trained to stand tall even when the odds were stacked against him. And right now, they were stacked high. Across the road, hidden in the brittle brush that clung to the ditch, James Harlow watched. His breath was steady, but his knuckles whitened around the grip of his concealed Beretta. A former Marine turned covert operative, James was a man built for pressure, lean, weathered, with eyes that saw more than they let on. At 36, he'd faced insurgents, ambushes, and worse, but this was different. This wasn't just a mission. This was personal. Rex wasn't just his K9 partner. He was family, the one constant in a life too often stained with betrayal and loss. Every taunt from the bikers stoked the rage simmering beneath James's calm exterior. He could count 7 of them, leather-clad, armed, and drunk on their own arrogance. The leader, a burly figure with tattoos snaking down his arms, stepped closer to Rex, chain dangling from his fist. "Time to put this dog down," he snarled, raising the weapon high. Rex's growl deepened, his stance widening as if daring the man to try. The gang erupted in laughter, their overconfidence blinding them to the shadow moving just out of sight. James took a slow breath, his mind racing. Charging in blind would get them both killed. He needed an opening, a crack in their sloppy bravado he could exploit. His fingers brushed the knife strapped to his thigh, but his eyes never left Rex. "Hang on, big guy," he thought. "I'm not losing you today." The seconds stretched into eternity, each one a test of his restraint. Then it happened. The tattooed biker swung the chain, aiming for Rex's skull. "Enough!" James's voice sliced through the noise like a blade, cold and commanding. He stepped from the ditch, emerging into the dying light, his presence a sudden storm breaking over the desert. The bikers froze, caught off guard, their laughter dying in their throats. James stood tall, his jacket dusty from the brush, his gaze locked on the man with the chain. "Get away from my dog," he said, each word a promise of consequences. Rex's ears twitched at the sound of James's voice. With a grunt of effort, the Rottweiler dragged himself forward, his battered body moving on sheer will. He reached James's side and pressed against his leg, a silent reunion that spoke louder than any words. Blood dripped onto the asphalt, but Rex stood firm, his massive head raised, eyes fixed on the bikers. The sight, a wounded dog standing loyal beside his handler, shifted something in the air. The balance tipped. The tattooed biker sneered, but hesitation flickered in his eyes. "You're outnumbered, pal," he spat, glancing at his crew. "Walk away, or you're both dead." The others gripped their weapons, pipes, knives, a pistol or two, but James didn't blink. He'd faced worse odds and walked away breathing. "Try me," James replied, his tone flat, deadly. His hand hovered near his gun, a quiet threat they couldn't ignore. The bikers shifted, muttering curses, their bravado cracking under the weight of his resolve. One by one, they backed toward their bikes, the leader tossing out a final growl. "This ain't over, Harlow." Engines roared to life, and they peeled away, dust swirling in their wake. James waited until the last rumble faded before dropping to one knee beside Rex. "You're tougher than all of them combined," he murmured, his voice softening as he ran a hand over the dog's broad head. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. Rex's breathing was shallow, his strength fading fast. James's fingers brushed something metallic in the dirt, a dog tag, old and scratched, the one Rex had worn years ago. He turned it over, frowning at its unexpected heft. As he lifted Rex into his arms, the weight of the tag nagged at him. This wasn't just a fight for survival. Something bigger was brewing, and that tag might hold the key. The battle for Rex's life was won, but as the first stars pierced the desert sky, James knew this was only the beginning. The desert night swallowed the last echoes of the steel serpent's engines, leaving only the hum of crickets and the faint whistle of wind across the dunes. James Harlow cradled Rex in his arms, the Rottweiler's weight a familiar burden against his chest. Blood seeped through James's jacket where Rex's torn flank pressed against him, but the dog's shallow breaths kept him moving. "Hang in there, buddy," he muttered, his voice steady despite the tightness in his throat. He crossed the highway in long strides, boots kicking up dust, and reached his truck, a beat-up Ford parked off the shoulder, its matte black paint blending into the shadows. He eased Rex onto the back seat, the dog's massive frame slumping against the worn leather. Rex let out a soft whine, his dark eyes locked on James, unwavering even through the haze of pain. James grabbed a first aid kit from under the passenger seat, his hands moving with the precision of a man who'd patched up more wounds than he cared to count, his own and others. He tore open a gauze pack and pressed it to the gash on Rex's side, wincing as the Rottweiler flinched. "I know it stings, big guy," he said, softening his tone. "Just a little longer." As he worked, memories flickered unbidden, sharp, jagged flashes of the day he'd found Rex. 2 years back, outside a derelict warehouse in El Paso, James had been tracking a lead on a smuggling ring. The tip had been solid, but what he hadn't expected was the pit in the basement. A dogfighting ring, the air thick with blood and desperation. Rex had been there, chained in a corner, ribs jutting under scarred fur, his muzzle raw from a gag. The other dogs were gone, dead or sold. But Rex, he'd stared at James with those same eyes, wild yet trusting, like he'd been waiting for him. James cut the chains that day, and Rex followed him out without a backward glance. They'd been a unit ever since, through missions, firefights, and nights when the past came knocking too loud. He shook off the memory, taping the gauze in place. Rex's breathing steadied, but his strength was fading. James climbed into the driver's seat, the engine rumbling to life as he floored it toward the nearest town, an hour's drive if he pushed the limits. The dashboard clock glowed 9:47 p.m. Every mile felt like a gamble, the road stretching endlessly under the truck's headlights. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back to rest on Rex's head, feeling the dog's warmth against his fingers. "You're not quittin' on me," he said, more to himself than to Rex. The vet clinic was a squat building on the edge of Dust Creek, its neon sign flickering 24/7 emergency care. James screeched into the lot, gravel crunching under the tires, and hauled Rex out of the truck. The night air bit cold as he burst through the doors, his voice sharp. "I need help. Now." The staff snapped into motion, a vet in scrubs, a tech with wide eyes, guiding him to a treatment room. James laid Rex on the steel table, stepping back as the vet took over, her hands quick but gentle. "He's a fighter," she said, glancing at the wounds. "We'll take it from here." James paced the waiting room, the linoleum squeaking under his boots. His jacket was stained dark, his hands still sticky with Rex's blood. The clock ticked too slow, 10:32, 11:15, midnight. He couldn't sit, couldn't think past the image of Rex on that table. To distract himself, he pulled the dog tag from his pocket, turning it over in his calloused fingers. It was old, scratched, the edges worn from years of wear. Rex was etched into the metal in block letters, a relic from his fighting days. But it felt heavy, too heavy for just steel. He fished a multi-tool from his kit and pried at the edge. A faint click, and the tag split open, revealing a tiny microchip nestled inside. James's pulse quickened. He grabbed his phone, hooked it to a portable scanner he kept in his glove box, old habits from the field, and synced the chip. The screen flickered, then loaded, a jumble of coordinates, coded names, and a single grainy photo. Him and Rex, crouched behind a crate during a mission 6 months back, unloading cargo in Nogales. Someone had been watching them. The realization hit like a punch. This wasn't a random ambush. The steel serpents hadn't just stumbled across them. They'd been hunting them, and this chip was why. James clenched the tag in his fist, his jaw tightening. Who'd planted it? And how long had it been on Rex? Before he could dig deeper, the vet emerged, wiping her hands on a towel. "He's stable," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Torn muscle, a few deep cuts, but he'll pull through. He needs rest, lots of it." Relief washed over him, loosening the knot in his chest. "Can I see him?" he asked. She nodded, leading him to the recovery room. Rex lay on a padded table, bandaged and groggy, and fluid dripping into his leg. His tail thumped once, weakly, as James approached. "Hey, tough guy," James said, kneeling beside him. He rested a hand on Rex's broad head, feeling the dog's warmth seep into his palm. Rex's eyes met his, a silent exchange, trust unbroken even now. James sank into a chair beside the table, the tag still clutched in his hand. "You've been carrying this all along, haven't you?" he murmured, his voice low. The photo on his phone stared back at him, a ghost from a mission he'd thought was routine. The steel serpents weren't just after Rex. They were after what he'd unknowingly carried. And if they'd tracked them this far, they wouldn't stop. He slipped the tag into his pocket, his mind already turning. Rex needed time to heal, but time was a luxury they didn't have. The clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as James leaned back, eyes narrowing. "We're in deep, partner," he said softly, watching Rex drift into a fitful sleep. "But we've been through worse." The fight for their lives had just begun, and whatever came next, they'd face it together, like always. The safe house crouched in the shadow of towering pines, a weathered cabin tucked off a dirt road 30 miles north of Dust Creek. Night had settled thick and heavy, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and sharpened every rustle. James pulled the truck into the gravel drive, killing the engine with a flick of his wrist. The silence hit hard after the clinic's sterile hum, broken only by Rex's ragged breathing from the back seat. James stepped out, his boots crunching on the frost-kissed ground, and scanned the woods. No headlights, no engines, just the faint chirp of crickets and the sway of branches in the wind. Safe, for now. He opened the back door and slid his arms under Rex, lifting the Rottweiler with a grunt. "Easy, big guy," he murmured as Rex whimpered, his bandaged flank stiff against James's chest. The dog's weight strained his arms, but he carried him inside, kicking the door shut behind them. The cabin smelled of damp wood and neglect. Dust coated the floors, and a cold fireplace gaped in the corner. James eased Rex onto a faded rug near the hearth, brushing a hand over the dog's head. "You're home for tonight," he said, his voice low and steady. Rex's ears twitched, his dark eyes following James even as his body sank into exhaustion. The vet had stitched him up, but the fight had taken its toll. Every move was a battle against pain. James didn't waste time. He bolted the door, dragged an old chair to brace it, and checked the windows, reinforced glass, a holdover from when he'd prepped this place as a fallback. It wasn't much, but it was defensible. Satisfied, he grabbed a tactical bag from under the floorboards, emergency supplies, ammo, a shotgun, and set it by the table. Rex needed rest, but James needed answers. He pulled the dog tag from his pocket, its scratched surface catching the dim light from a lantern he'd lit. Sitting at the scarred wooden table, he pried the tag open again and plugged the microchip into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, spitting out the same fragmented data. Coordinates in the southwest, a list of coded names, that photo of him and Rex in Nogales. He scrolled deeper, his jaw tightening as a new file loaded. A grainy video, timestamped 3 months back. It showed Rex, collarless, pacing a kennel in some warehouse, his growls echoing off concrete walls. A voice off-screen barked orders, "Tag him before the next run." Then a hand, gloved, anonymous, slipped the tag onto Rex's neck. James froze, the pieces clicking into place. Someone had planted this on Rex deliberately, long before tonight's ambush. The steel serpents weren't just after him. They'd been tracking him through Rex. His own partner turned into a walking beacon. Son of a bitch, he muttered, slamming the laptop shut. He glanced at Rex, guilt twisting in his gut. I should have seen it sooner. A low growl from Rex snapped him out of it. The Rottweiler struggled to his feet, ears perked toward the door, his massive frame trembling but alert. James grabbed the shotgun, instincts kicking in as he moved to the window. Through the glass, he caught the glint of headlights weaving through the trees. Motorcycles, at least 5, their engines a growing roar. The steel serpents had found them. They don't waste time, do they? He said, his grip tightening on the weapon. He crouched beside Rex, resting a hand on the dog's neck. Stay low, buddy. We've got this. Rex's growl deepened, a rumble of defiance despite his wounds. James positioned himself by the door, peering through a crack as the bikes rolled into the clearing. 7 men dismounted, leather jackets, weapons glinting, spreading out like wolves circling prey. The leader, Stone, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the night. Flush him out. This ends now. 2 bikers approached the cabin, one hefting a crowbar, the other a pistol. James waited, heart pounding in sync with their footsteps. As the crowbar guy raised his arm to smash the lock, James yanked a flashbang from his bag, pulled the pin, and lobbed it through a side window. The blast erupted, light and sound splitting the darkness, sending the bikers stumbling back, clutching their ears. He didn't hesitate. Shotgun raised, he slipped out the back door, flanking the dazed pair. A swift jab to the first guy's throat dropped him, and a kick sent the second's pistol skittering into the dirt. James ducked behind a woodpile as bullets sprayed from the others, splintering the cabin's walls. Inside, Rex barked, a sharp, fierce sound that carried over the chaos. Even hurt, he was ready to fight. Stone's voice roared again. You're only delaying it, Harlow. We know what you've got. The tag. They wanted the chip. James gritted his teeth, retreating inside as the gang regrouped. The front door shuddered under a heavy kick, and he braced it with his shoulder, buying time. Rex limped to his side, planting himself between James and the threat, his growl a steady warning. Good boy, James said, pride surging through him. The bikers weren't playing anymore. A Molotov cocktail sailed through a window, shattering against the floor in a bloom of fire. James grabbed a blanket from the couch and smothered the flames, coughing as smoke filled the room. Time to go, he muttered, eyes darting to the trapdoor under the rug, a crawlspace he'd dug out years ago. He hauled it open, the hinges creaking, and gestured to Rex. Come on, big guy. Rex hesitated, his bulk barely fitting, but a sharp whistle from James spurred him down. James followed, pulling the trapdoor shut as boots thundered overhead. The crawlspace was tight, damp earth pressing against his back, but it stretched beneath the cabin to the woods beyond. He could hear Stone shouting, "Tear it apart." The gang was trashing the place, oblivious to their escape. Halfway through, a muffled crash shook the tunnel, something heavy collapsing above. James pushed forward, dirt crumbling around them, until they emerged into the cold night air, hidden by a thicket of pines. Rex stumbled out beside him, his bandages stained with fresh blood, but his head stayed high. James caught his breath, scanning the glow of the burning cabin in the distance. We're not done yet, he said, resting a hand on Rex's shoulder. The tag weighed heavy in his pocket, a ticking bomb he couldn't ignore. The steel serpents wouldn't stop, not until they had it, or until he made them. He adjusted his grip on the shotgun, resolve hardening in his chest. Let's show him who they're messing with. The woods stretched dark and endless ahead, but with Rex by his side, James knew they weren't running blind. They were fighting back. The forest loomed like a black wall beyond the smoldering ruin of the safe house, its pines clawing at a starless sky. Smoke stung James Harlow's lungs as he half ran, half stumbled through the underbrush, one arm steadying Rex against his side. The Rottweiler's limp had worsened, his bandaged flank dragging with every step, but his ears stayed perked, tracking the distant growl of engines. The steel serpents weren't far behind. Headlights flickered through the trees, their beams slicing the darkness like knives. Just a little farther, James muttered, his breath clouding in the crisp night air. His boots sank into the soft earth, pine needles crunching underfoot as he guided Rex deeper into the woods. The dog's weight pressed against him, a reminder of how much tonight had already cost them. Blood seeped through Rex's bandages, staining James's hand, but the Rottweiler didn't falter. His loyalty was a steel thread pulling them forward. They reached a small clearing, the ground leveling out beneath a canopy of twisted branches. James dropped to one knee, easing Rex down beside a gnarled stump. "Take a breather, buddy," he said, his voice low but firm. Rex sank onto his haunches, chest heaving, his dark eyes locked on James with that same unshakable trust. James pulled a canteen from his pack and tipped water into his palm, letting Rex lap it up. The dog's tongue rasped against his skin, a quiet moment amid the storm. He couldn't linger. The hum of motorcycles grew louder, a relentless pulse echoing through the forest. James wiped his hand on his jeans and pulled the dog tag from his pocket, its scratched surface cold against his fingers. He flipped open his laptop, the screen's faint glow casting shadows across Rex's fur as he synced the microchip again. The files loaded faster this time, spilling secrets he hadn't had time to process back at the cabin. The coordinates mapped a spiderweb of routes, highways and backroads stretching from Arizona to Nevada, dotted with drop points. Trafficking, no doubt. Drugs, weapons, maybe worse. The coded names flickered past: Raven, Ghost, Ironclad. Then one stopped him cold. Maddox, Ryan Maddox, his old squad mate from the Corps, a man he'd once trusted with his life. Memories crashed in. Maddox laughing over a campfire in Kandahar. Maddox taking a bullet to the shoulder during a raid. Maddox walking away after a botched op in Kabul went south. Rumors had trailed him after that. Black market deals, a dishonorable discharge hushed up by brass. Now his name glowed on the screen, tied to the steel serpents. James's stomach twisted. "You son of a bitch," he whispered, glancing at Rex. The Rottweiler tilted his head, sensing the shift in his handler's mood. If Maddox was involved, this wasn't just a biker gang with a grudge. It was a network, deep and dirty, and they'd been pawns in it longer than James realized. He scrolled back to the video he'd seen earlier. The kennel, the gloved hand slipping the tag onto Rex. Maddox's voice wasn't in the clip, but his shadow loomed over it all. A sharp crack split the silence, a twig snapping, too close. James slammed the laptop shut, shoving it into his pack as he grabbed his Beretta. "Stay quiet," he hissed, pulling Rex behind the stump. The dog's growl rumbled low, barely audible, but his muscles tensed, ready to spring despite the pain. James peered through the brush, his pulse steady as a beam of light swept across the trees. Voices followed, gruff, urgent. "They're close. Spread out." He counted 3 flashlight beams, maybe more, weaving through the pines. The gang hadn't given up. They'd tracked the smoke, the trail, maybe even Rex's blood. James's mind raced. A straight fight was suicide. Rex couldn't handle it, and he was down to half a mag. Running blind would only delay the inevitable. Then he spotted it. A shallow ravine cutting through the forest floor, its edges cloaked in thick undergrowth. Risky, but it might buy them time. "Come on, Rex," he whispered, helping the dog to his feet. They slid down the steep incline, James bracing Rex's weight as dirt crumbled beneath them. The ravine was narrow, its rocky walls barely shoulder wide, but it hid them from the lights above. James pressed his back against a boulder, pulling Rex close. The dog's breathing was heavy, his warmth seeping into James's side, but he stayed silent, years of training overriding his instincts. Footsteps thudded overhead, gravel skittering down the slope. "He's got to be around here," one biker growled, his beam flashing inches from their hiding spot. James held his breath, hand resting on Rex's neck, feeling the steady thrum of his pulse. The light passed, the voices fading as the gang moved west. For now, they'd dodged the net. James exhaled, leaning his head back against the rock. "We've been hunted before, haven't we?" he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Rex nudged his hand, a soft press of his muzzle that said more than words ever could. They'd survived ambushes in deserts half a world away. Insurgents, IEDs, nights when the odds were a razor's edge. But this time, it was personal. Maddox had turned their bond into a target, and the steel serpents were his hounds. He pulled the tag out again, turning it over in his fingers. The coordinates burned in his mind. One set wasn't far, a drop point maybe 20 miles north. If he could get there, he might find proof, leverage to turn this fight around. But Rex needed rest, and the gang wasn't slowing down. James tucked the tag away, his jaw tightening. "We're not just running, partner," he said, meeting Rex's gaze. "We're hitting back." The forest stretched endless around them, a maze of shadows and threats. James adjusted his pack, checking the Beretta's clip, 6 rounds left. He helped Rex to his feet, the dog's limp more pronounced, but his spirit unbroken. "One step at a time," he said, guiding them along the ravine's edge. The headlights faded behind them, but the hum of engines lingered, a promise of pursuit. A faint glow broke the horizon, dawn creeping in, painting the sky in streaks of gray and gold. James paused, scanning the trees for movement. They were still out there, hunting, but so was he. With Rex by his side, battered but standing, he felt the weight of their fight settle into something solid, something worth every scar. The steel serpents wanted the tag, the data, the power it held, but they'd underestimated the man and the dog who carried it. And that, James knew, would be their mistake. The first light of dawn crept through the forest, a pale glow that turned the pines into silhouettes against a steel-gray sky. James Harlow pushed through the underbrush, his arm hooked under Rex's chest to steady the Rottweiler's faltering steps. The ravine had bought them a head start, but the distant rumble of engines told him the steel serpents weren't far behind. Every breath burned in his lungs. Every glance at Rex's blood-streaked bandages tightened the knot in his chest. They needed cover now. Ahead, half hidden by overgrown vines, loomed the skeletal frame of an abandoned ranger station. Its roof sagged under years of rot, windows cracked and clouded with grime, but the walls still stood, sturdy enough to hold. James adjusted his grip on Rex, his voice a low rasp. "Almost there, buddy." The dog's ears flicked forward, his massive head lifting despite the weight of his injuries. Together, they stumbled toward the door, its hinges groaning as James shoved it open. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust blanketed the floor, swirling around a rusted metal cabinet and a splintered desk. James eased Rex onto a patch of bare wood near the wall, the Rottweiler collapsing with a soft grunt. His chest rose and fell unevenly, bandages dark with fresh blood, but his eyes stayed sharp, tracking James's every move. "Rest up," James said, brushing a hand over Rex's broad head. "You've earned it." He didn't have time to linger. The station was a shell, but it had bones, thick timber walls, a narrow back exit, a vantage point from the loft. James barricaded the front door with the cabinet, its scrape echoing in the stillness, and wedged a chair under the knob. He checked the windows. Most were too high to breach easily, but he couldn't take chances. From his pack, he pulled a tactical shotgun and a spare clip for his Beretta, laying them within reach. Rex needed a break, but the fight wasn't waiting. He crouched beside the dog, offering water from his canteen. Rex lapped it slowly, his tongue rough against James's palm. "You're a damn tank," James murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Rex's tail thumped once, a weak echo of his usual vigor, but it was enough to steady James's nerves. He pulled the dog tag from his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the stakes. Plugging it into his laptop, he reopened the files, scanning for anything he'd missed. The coordinates glowed on the screen, drop points strung across the desert like a noose. One caught his eye, a warehouse 20 miles north, marked ironclad. The name from the list, linked to Maddox. James clenched his jaw, piecing it together. If Maddox was running this, the steel serpents were just muscle, hired guns for a bigger game. The video flashed in his mind. Rex in that kennel, tagged like a pawn. "They used you," he said, glancing at Rex. "But they don't know what they're up against." A sharp crack outside jolted him upright, glass shattering against the station's east wall. James snapped the laptop shut and grabbed the shotgun, moving to the window. 2 bikers stood in the clearing, their flashlights cutting through the dawn haze. One held a crowbar, the other a pistol, their silhouettes stark against the trees. "He's in there," the pistol guy growled, voice carrying through the thin walls. "Let's smoke him out." James steadied his breath, waiting as they approached. The crowbar biker swung at the door, the metal clanging against the barricade. James kicked the cabinet forward, slamming it into the guy's chest and sending him sprawling. The second raised his pistol, but James fired a warning shot through the window. Glass exploded outward, and the biker dove for cover behind a rusted barrel. "Stay down," James shouted, his voice a whip crack in the stillness. Rex stirred, ears perking at the noise. He tried to rise, legs trembling under his bulk, but James pressed a hand to his shoulder. "Not this time, partner," he said firmly. "I've got it." Rex's growl rumbled low, a protest, but he sank back, trusting James to take the lead. The standoff held, a tense heartbeat of silence, until the roar of more engines split the air. James peeked through the cracked window, counting headlights. For bikes, maybe 5, rolling in fast. The steel serpents weren't messing around anymore. "Harlow," a voice bellowed. Stone, the leader, his figure unmistakable in the dawn light. "You've got nowhere to run. Hand over the tag, and we might let the mutt live." The threat lit a fire in James's gut. He gripped the shotgun tighter, mind racing for a play. The station wouldn't hold against a full assault, not with firebombs or numbers like that. He scanned the room, spotting an old radio on the desk. Dead battery, but it didn't need to work. He flipped it on, static crackling loud enough to carry outside, then tossed it near the back exit, a decoy to draw them off. It worked. 2 bikers circled toward the noise, shouting to Stone, "He's bolting." James used the split-second distraction, slipping to the front window and firing a blast that clipped one's shoulder. The guy howled, dropping his weapon, and the others scattered for cover. But the reprieve was short. A bottle sailed through the air, shattering against the wall in a bloom of flame. Another Molotov, licking up the dry timber. James grabbed a dusty tarp from the floor and smothered the fire, smoke stinging his eyes. "We're out of time," he muttered, coughing as he hauled Rex to his feet. The back exit was their only shot, narrow, half-blocked by a fallen beam, but clear enough to squeeze through. "Come on, big guy," he urged, guiding Rex toward it. The dog limped forward, his bulk scraping the frame, but he pushed through, driven by the same grit that had kept him standing on that highway. James followed, shotgun slung over his shoulder, as the station groaned behind them, flames climbing higher, glass popping under the heat. They hit the woods running, or as close to it as Rex could manage. The bikers' shouts faded into the crackle of fire, but more engines revved in the distance, reinforcements closing in. James glanced at Rex, the dog's head low but steady, blood dripping onto the pine needles. "They won't stop," he said, more to himself than anyone. He patted the tag in his pocket, its secrets heavier than ever. The warehouse loomed in his mind. 20 miles, a chance to turn the tables. But Rex was fading, and the forest was a trap tightening around them. James set his jaw, resolve hardening like steel. "We're not going down easy, partner." The dawn sky bled gold above them, a faint promise of daylight in a night that refused to end. With Rex at his side, James pressed on, every step a defiance of the odds. The steel serpents wanted a fight. They'd get one. Fog rolled through the forest as dawn broke, a gray shroud that clung to the pines and muffled the world in silence. James Harlow trudged onward, his arm braced under Rex's trembling frame, the Rottweiler's weight heavier with every step. The ranger station's flames glowed faintly behind them, a dying beacon swallowed by the mist. The steel serpent's engines had faded for now, but James knew better than to trust the quiet. They were out there, regrouping, hunting. His boots sank into the damp earth as he scanned the horizon. The coordinates from the tag burned in his mind. 20 miles north, a warehouse marked ironclad. It was a lead, maybe a trap, but it was all he had. Rex's breathing rasped beside him, each exhale a struggle, his bandages soaked dark with blood. "We're close, buddy," James lied, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. He couldn't lose him, not after everything. The trees thinned ahead, giving way to a narrow clearing where an old wooden bridge spanned a dry creek bed. Its planks sagged, splintered from years of neglect, but it was the only path north without backtracking into the gang's net. James guided Rex toward it, the dog's claws scraping the dirt as he limped forward. They'd barely reached the edge when the silence shattered, engines roaring, headlights piercing the fog like predator eyes. James spun, shotgun raised, as 5 motorcycles burst into view. The steel serpents fanned out, cutting off retreat, their leather jackets glistening with dew. Stone dismounted first, his burly frame towering over the others, a crowbar dangling from his hand. His face twisted into a sneer as he stepped forward, voice booming. "End of the line, Harlow. You and that mutt are done." Rex growled, a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground, his hackles rising despite his wounds. James tightened his grip on the shotgun, planting himself between the gang and his partner. "You want him?" he said, his tone cold as the fog. "Come take him." Stone laughed, a harsh bark that echoed off the trees. "You've got balls, I'll give you that. But you're out of moves." He jerked his head, and two bikers flanked left, another pair right, weapons glinting, pipes, a chain, a pistol. "Maddox wants that tag, and he don't care if you're breathing when we get it." The name hit James like a slug to the chest. Maddox. Confirmation of the betrayal he dreaded. "So he's pulling your strings." James shot back, stalling for time. His eyes darted to the bridge, 50 feet, maybe less. If they could reach it, they might outrun this. "What's he promised you?" "A cut of his dirty money." Stone's sneer faltered, just for a second. "More than you'll ever see," he growled, raising the crowbar. "Last chance, hand it over." James didn't flinch. "Go to hell." The word barely left his mouth before Stone charged, crowbar swinging for his skull. James ducked, the metal whistling past his ear, and slammed the shotgun stock into Stone's gut. The biker doubled over, gasping, but the others rushed in. A chain lashed out, catching James's shoulder. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but he spun, firing a blast that sent the chain guy sprawling into the dirt. Rex lunged, a blur of black and tan, his jaws clamping onto the arm of a pistol-wielding biker. The man screamed, dropping the gun as Rex shook him like a rag doll, blood spraying from the bite. "Get him off," the guy howled, but James was already moving, tackling another biker into the mud. Fists flew, his knuckles split against bone, but he didn't stop. Stone recovered, roaring as he swung again. James rolled aside, the crowbar splintering the ground where he'd been, and snapped off a shot. Buckshot tore through Stone's leg, dropping him to one knee with a curse. "You're dead," Stone bellowed, clutching the wound, but James didn't wait. He whistled sharp. Rex released his prey and staggered back, blood dripping from his muzzle. "Bridge now," James shouted, hauling Rex toward the rickety span. The dog stumbled, his strength failing, but James hooked an arm under him, half dragging, half carrying him across. The planks groaned under their weight, nails popping loose as they ran. Behind them, the bikers scrambled to their feet, Stone's voice cutting through. "Don't let him get away." James glanced back. 3 were up, charging, their boots pounding the earth. The bridge swayed, a crack splitting the air as a support beam buckled. "Hold on," he grunted, pushing harder. They were halfway when the pistol guy, arm mangled, raised his good hand and fired. The shot went wide, splintering a rail, but the sound spurred James on. They hit the far side just as the bridge shuddered, planks collapsing into the creek bed below. James dove, pulling Rex with him as the structure gave way. Wood snapped, metal screeched, and the bikers' shouts turned to curses as the gap widened. Dust billowed up, the fog swallowing the wreckage. James landed hard, his shoulders screaming, but he rolled to his knees, checking Rex. The Rottweiler lay panting, his eyes glazed but alive. Blood streaked his fur, fresh from the fight, and his legs trembled as he tried to stand. "Easy, big guy," James said, voice breaking as he pulled Rex close. The dog's head slumped against his chest, a weak nudge that tore at James's heart. "You saved me again." Across the chasm, Stone staggered to the edge, his leg a mess of red, his face twisted with rage. "This ain't over, Harlow," he yelled, voice hoarse. "Maddox'll bury you." The surviving bikers dragged their wounded back to the bikes, engines revving as they retreated into the fog. James didn't answer. He lifted Rex into his arms, the dog's bulk a crushing weight, and stumbled into the trees. The bridge's collapse had bought them time. Minutes, maybe hours, but not safety. His shoulder throbbed, blood soaking his sleeve, but he pushed on, the warehouse coordinates a beacon in his mind. The fog thickened, blurring the world into shades of gray. James's breath came in ragged bursts, his legs burning, but he didn't stop. Rex's warmth against him was all that mattered. Proof they were still in this, still fighting. "We're not done," he whispered, his voice raw. "Not yet." The forest closed around them, a labyrinth of shadows and silence. Maddox's name echoed in his head, a ghost turned enemy, pulling strings from the dark. The tag in his pocket felt like a live grenade, data that could end this or destroy them. James tightened his hold on Rex, resolve hardening through the pain. They'd survived the night. Now it was time to strike back, even if it cost them everything. The fog thinned as James Harlow climbed a low hill, each step a battle against the weight in his arms and the fire in his veins. Rex hung limp against his chest, the Rottweilers breathing shallow but stubborn, a faint rhythm that anchored James to the moment. Blood soaked through his jacket, his own from the gray's shoulder, Rex's from the fight that had nearly broken them both. The forest fell away behind them, giving way to a rocky rise overlooking the desert, a vast, sun-bleached expanse stretching to the horizon. Dawn painted the sky in fragile streaks of gold and pink, the first real light after a night that felt endless. James sank to his knees near the edge, easing Rex onto the ground with a gentleness that belied his battered state. The dog's eyes fluttered open, dark pools reflecting the sunrise, and his tail gave a single, weak thump. "There you go, big guy," James said, his voice cracking as he brushed a hand over Rex's matted fur. "We made it this far." He pulled his pack off, digging for the last of his first aid supplies, a roll of gauze, a half-empty bottle of antiseptic. His hands shook as he worked, peeling back Rex's sodden bandages to clean the deepest gash. The Rottweiler flinched, a soft whine escaping, but didn't pull away. I know, James murmured, his throat tight. "You're tougher than me, always have been." He wrapped the wound tight, blood staining his fingers, and sat back, exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. The dog tag rested heavy in his pocket, its secrets a chain he couldn't shake. James pulled it out, turning it over in his palm as the microchip's data replayed in his mind. Coordinates, names, Maddox's betrayal. He plugged it into his laptop one last time, the screen flickering to life with a final file he'd missed, a text fragment, decrypted and stark. "You can't stop this alone, Harlow. Give it up, or they all burn." Maddox's words, a taunt from the shadows. James stared at the message, his jaw clenching. He thought of the warehouse, 20 miles north, a chance to end this or walk into a trap. He thought of the missions they'd run, the lives they'd saved, the ones they couldn't. Friends lost to bullets and bad calls, Maddox among them once, until he'd turned, trading honor for power. The tag was proof of a network bigger than the Steel Serpents, a web of corruption James had spent years fighting without knowing how deep it ran. He shut the laptop, sliding it into his pack. "They used you, Rex," he said, his voice low, "and I let it happen." The guilt gnawed at him. 2 years since he'd cut those chains in El Paso, 2 years of trust, and he'd missed the tag's weight until it was too late. Rex nudged his hand, a slow press of his muzzle, as if to say it didn't matter. James rested his forehead against the dog's, breathing in the familiar scent of fur and blood. "You're all I've got left," he whispered. The desert sprawled below, silent and unforgiving, a canvas of sand and scrub that held no answers. James sat back, pulling Rex closer, the dog's warmth a lifeline against the chill creeping into his bones. He'd lost too much, brothers in the Corps, a life he'd once imagined after the war, a trust in men like Maddox. But Rex was here, scarred and steady, the one piece of his world that hadn't crumbled. A faint sound pierced the quiet, sirens, distant but growing, their wail drifting up from the highway miles away. James tensed, his hand drifting to the Beretta at his hip. Rescue or reckoning? He couldn't tell. The Steel Serpents were wounded, Stone's leg, their numbers cut, but they weren't gone. Maddox was out there, pulling strings, and the tag in his pocket was a fuse still burning. He looked at Rex, the dog's eyes half closed but fixed on him, a quiet promise that hadn't faded. "We're still here, partner," James said, his voice rough with something between grief and defiance. "That's what matters." He stood, wincing as his shoulder screamed, and lifted Rex into his arms one more time. The dog was heavy, too heavy for a man running on fumes, but James didn't care. He'd carry him to the ends of the earth if he had to. They started down the hill, slow and unsteady, toward the desert's edge. The sirens grew louder, a thread of hope or a noose tightening. He wouldn't know until they met it. The warehouse loomed in his mind, a shadow he couldn't outrun, but so did the fight still left in them. Maddox wanted the tag, the power it held, but he'd have to pry it from their hands. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them. A man and his dog, battered but unbroken, walking into a future unwritten. The desert swallowed their footsteps, the horizon stretching wide and wild. Whatever came next, salvation, revenge, or ruin, James knew one thing. They'd face it together. And that was enough.